Hi, this is Marita from Ruby Soup with Pearl Juice, and today I want to talk about my favorite angst-filled romances. Now, I am a person who usually does not read romance. I know very little about that genre. However, I do like angst, and I think that angst as an emotion can make like really great, powerful literature. And even if these books that I'm going to talk about today are not strictly romances per se, then they could be kind of categorized as literary fiction with love stories. And I also kind of just want to put spotlight on these books because they're not, well, one of them is very much talked about, but the other one's not so much. And as usual, I should probably mention that this was a theme on Top 5 Wednesday a few months ago. I couldn't do it then because I didn't have my YouTube channel up then yet, but I will leave the links down below as usual. So let's get started. The first angsty romance that I want to talk to you guys about is actually a ongoing comic series called Saga, written by Brian K. Vaughan. This is a science fiction war-based comic that follows two sides on an intergalactic civil war. One is Alana. She is a winged alien species, and the other one is Marco. He is a horn-based alien species. And these two basically, when the series begins, we actually see Alana give birth to their daughter, and the plot kind of unravels from there. But in later volumes, after volume 1, we actually get to see how they met. And Marco was basically a prisoner at Alana's side's field, and she was supposed to be his guard. But because she started reading her favorite book to him, and he ended up liking the book too, then they kind of bonded over that, and then of course they fell in love, and then everything kind of just took off from there. And the thing that I like about this love story, I mean, there's a lot of other things in this series too, but what makes the love story really good in this series is that Alana and Marco have their own baggage, and it sometimes does cause problems in the relationship. And especially since they have a kid, that really complicates things even further. And this comic is like really honest with that they're both very fragile people that make humongous mistakes. And they're not in the best circumstances when it comes to having a kid because they're both basically war criminals because they fell in love with the enemy side and had a kid with the enemy side. And they're being hunted for it. And in fact, a lot of people want to even hurt the kid. But despite this really unfortunate situation, they're trying their best to be a happy family and to stay together and find some form of happiness. And that is just like such powerful storytelling. I mean, I guess this is not traditional angsty romance because they have a kid, but I still think that it's a very interesting take on it because it's not glamorized, it's not idealized, it's very honest, and it's really, this punches you in the feelings several times. And for people that aren't much for romance, I can say that this series tackles a lot of really interesting political things. There's stuff like war propaganda and resentment and about casualties and about how women and children suffer in war, and also like, you know, the morally gray areas that you are forced into when you're in a war. And it's also a very diverse series. Alana is black and Marco is Asian, and there's also aliens that are Hispanic. So it completely averts the trope of the white alien or the Caucasian alien, which, you know, like stuff like Superman, My Favorite Martian were guilty of this. And there's also LGBT representation. There's a lesbian character, there's a gay couple, there's also a trans woman that shows up, and she's really cool. I love her. She is really sassy. And it also has like really creative aliens. Like there's one alien that's basically a seal, and he's like a shepherd, and he's just so adorable. So yeah, so there's like something for everyone in this series. There's politics, there's science fiction, there's diversity, there's romance, So check it out. You'll love it, I promise. The second angsty romance that I want to talk about is The Sorrow of War by Bao Nin, specifically Kien and Puong. I have actually blogged about Kien and Puong before. I'll leave the link to that below. But basically, I'll give a little bit of a mini history about this book. This book is originally written in Vietnamese. It is written by a Vietnamese man who served in the Vietnam War on the side of the North. And this book is kind of very heavily based on those experiences. It tells the story of Kien, who, as a very young, idealistic man, joins the North side and wants to fight for communism. And he has a girlfriend called Puong, who is a little bit more cynical and is very skeptical about the propaganda that was going on back then. But they're still high school sweethearts. And they get torn apart by the Vietnam War that starts because he has to go and serve. And when he then comes back from the war, Kien is kind of broken, and he wants to get back together with Phuong, and they still love each other, but because of his post-traumatic stress syndrome and the guilt that he feels for the things that he did, then they're still kind of torn apart. And the thing that I like about this love story is that, firstly, Phuong is an incredibly strong, well-rounded, three-dimensional female character, which isn't always the case with male writers. But despite this book being written by a man, Phuong is a incredibly well-written character. I love her. She's really fierce and sassy and kind of no nonsense. And I really like Kien. Because the whole book is from his point of view. So we see him during the war, and we see him do even really horrible things. But because it's from his point of view, we kind of understand the panic and the chaos that people in war are in, and how those situations kind of force you to even do things that are really horrible. And it's very much, I guess, I have only seen the movie, but very much like All Quiet on the Western Front, where it kind of shows that no matter what side of a war you're on, there's, soldiers are just people that are there doing their job, and it leads to them seeing and doing horrible things and having horrible things even happen to them. That, I think there's a saying called that nobody wins in a war, and this book very much captures that in a war there are no winners, there's only losers. And in fact, this book, I don't think it was ever really banned in Vietnam, but it was kind of controversial when it first came out, because Bao Nin says straight out in the book that the war is very good for politicians but awful for everyone else, which was a bit of a controversy back then, but it still is a really interesting, really thought-provoking statement. So this is it's a really good piece of anti-war literature. And the thing that makes the anti-war message come out so strongly is this love story, because Kien and Phuong go from being these teenagers that were in love to these broken adults that can't quite find each other. And you really because you see them as teenagers and you see what could have been, you just are so your emotions are in such a puddle when you're reading this, because you want these two to be together, but you don't know if they can, because Kien has post-traumatic stress syndrome and guilt, and she has also kind of moved on. But you really want them to be together, but yeah, it's the unjust situation of it all really comes through in this book, and it's really devastating. It's so horrible, but I think it's a really important read, and it has some really good messages in it. And in fact, the romance aspect, I have to say, a lot of books about war have romances in them, but usually they're kind of forgettable. But in here, it actually really works to the book's benefit, and it really completes the narrative. So yeah, if you haven't read this, pick it up, read it. It is a classic for a reason. It's so incredibly good and memorable. If you read it, you'll never forget it. I can guarantee that. So, yeah, check this out. And next, I'm gonna talk about a book that is actually more recent and was a bit controversial even. All the Rivers by Dorit Rabian. This is a book written by a Israeli woman who has Iranian parents, and that is the same thing was the main character in here. She is also of Persian descent, but from Israel, so that is Own Voices presentation yet again. And when this book was first published in 2014, I think, in Israel, it actually got banned because there were certain schools, I believe, if I remember now correctly, that didn't want this to... They didn't want students to read this because they thought that it gave too much of a positive image of intercultural relationships, and they didn't want to promote that. But then there was a huge backslash, and it became a bestseller in Israel, and now it's been translated into, I think it was just in 2016, translated into English. And I just read this, actually, this year, and this is actually one of my favorite reads from this year. It tells the story of Liat, who is, as I said, a Persian Israeli woman, and she is living temporarily in New York, and she meets Hilmi, who is a Palestinian man. And despite Liat kind of thinking that nothing should really happen between them, they start to bond and they become friends, and then they end up sleeping together, and a romance kind of blossoms from that. And the whole time when they're together, then Liat is continually thinking that I can't get too involved, I can't get too attached because my parents wouldn't approve of this. I can't let this get too serious. But of course, that's not exactly what happens. In this book, both Liat and Hilmi are like really complex characters. They have their own virtues and vices. They do things that are really like, you kind of shake your head and you're frustrated at them, but at the same time they do such kind, sweet things that you end up rooting for them anyway. And they're like that towards each other. They can be really cruel to each other, but they can also be incredibly kind to each other. And it feels very real considering the situation that they're in, where basically they both kind of are on like two sides of a very politically charged situation, the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So it seems so this book tackles that really realistically, where they kind of do support each other, but they have some baggage there that comes up a little bit. And it's also like they're so happy together at the same time, but then Liat is continually like, no, we can't really be together. And that's like, it really tugs at the heartstrings, because you really want these two to be together because they have such incredibly good chemistry and they are so cute together. But Liat is like really letting her prejudice come in here and tear them apart, and it's just so incredibly heartbreaking. And I think like that especially really does a really big service to this story, because it's actually that's the aspect of this book, that it's kind of trying to say like we should be tolerant and we shouldn't let prejudice get in the way of things. And the way how it's written in this book, it comes across so incredibly well. This actually did not get that much attention last year when it was translated, but I think it's easily one of the best new releases that are out there right now. If you haven't read this, pick it up. It's really worth your time. It kind of tackles politics through romance in a really complex, really engaging way. And these two characters are just so great. In fact, these are some of the most memorable characters that I've read in quite a while. I've done a full review on this. I'll link it down below if you want to know more details. But this is the final verdict. Absolutely check this out. You won't be disappointed. And my favorite angsty romance of all time is The Lover by Margaret Duras. This is probably the most famous, or, well, maybe almost the most famous out of all of these books. This is a French novel that was published in 1985. And you guys have probably heard of the film version with Tony Leung that came out in the 90s, I believe. And this tells the story of a teenage girl who's living in Vietnam at the time. And she's living with her single mother who has depressive episodes, and she also has two brothers, one who she's really attached to and one who's like really this horrific bully who does really horrible emotional and also physical abuse towards her and the other brother. And because of the mother's depressive episodes, they actually are poor. Because due to the mother's mental health issues, she can't fully work and fully support the children. And this girl one day comes across a rich Chinese man, and they kind of start an affair. And the whole book kind of takes off from there. And this is really short. It's 100 and I believe even 50 pages. No, actually it's 130 pages long, so it's really short. But the thing that makes this book work so well is actually the language. Margaret Duras is one of France's most famous authors, and it's easy to see why, because the writing in this book, it's like poetry. It kind of just leaps off the page. It's so beautifully written, and there's sentences that you just want to read over and over again. They're so well crafted. It's like pearls on a string almost. And as with any good book, was any good romance, this is a quite sexy read. It's actually, I think Flavor Wire had this on their list of sexiest books of all time, and I agree with that statement. And I also like how, despite that this book is like really short, it really tackles all these really interesting themes like class and gender and race, and it tackles them with quite a lot of depth. Especially considering that this is written by a white French woman in the 80s. I, for instance, think that one thing that's really interesting about this book is that it kind of talks about a time when people actually didn't think that people from different races could actually even fall in love with each other. Which is, of course, nowadays, well, I guess that's still the case sometimes, but it's not as common now as it was back then, which is also interesting when you're kind of reading about such a different time, because I think this book takes place in the 40s, actually. The 40s or the 50s. And it's quite sad. And as with most of these romances, this is a doomed romance. They don't really get together, but but nevertheless, you get to be on their journey, and it's really engaging, and it's really sexy, and it's well worth the read. I will say that I have also seen the movie. I think the movie's okay. I think the book's better. I mean, there's no denying that Tony Leung is really hot, so it's worth for that. But I would actually recommend that before you see the movie, read this, because this has a lot more depth and a lot more. Like, the movie is basically just a love story, but this one actually has the politics and the depth that the movie kind of took out. So do read this book. It's great. It's actually one of my favorite books of all time. So, and actually, before I say goodbye, I'll actually even mention that I've been to Margaret Duras's grave. I gave her a pen because, she's a writer, so people leave pens there so that she can write in the afterlife if she needs to. I don't know if I don't really believe in an afterlife, but in case I'm wrong, it's good for her to have some pens for the journey. So those were my favorite angst-filled romances, or angsty romances, depending on which term you like better. What are some of your favorite romances with angst in them? comment down below. I would love to hear some recommendations or some suggestions. And if you like this video, click the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye!